everyone. This is Blue Roads Education Group, and I am excited today to have another wonderful guest with me. This is Penny Franklin, and I've known Penny for quite a few years. First, when I worked in Montgomery County Public Schools in Southwest Virginia, I knew her as a school board member. And then in more recent years, I get to see her in action doing amazing work with the Dialogue on Race. So I'm so excited that she's agreed to be with me today and tell her story in the Blue Roads framework, Homegrown Solutions for a Patchwork World. So welcome, Penny. Glad you're here.
Hi, good to be here. Thank you.
So we're going to just start by asking you to speak to our homegrown quadrant, which is where were you grown, who are your people, and why are those roots important to you?
I was born and raised here in Southwest Virginia, Montgomery County, Christiansburg. I'm one of 7 children, number 4 in the middle. I grew up in a segregated community. The schools integrated when I was in the 2nd grade, and that had a huge impact on me. I did not really know it then, but I can tell with the work that I do and reflecting back on why I think and push so hard about different things. A lot of that comes back from experiences through going through integration. My father is from Christiansburg, was from Christiansburg, went to Youngstown, Ohio, as many African Americans did in the 40s, 50s, to find work because they couldn't find work in the South. Met my mother in Youngstown, Ohio, married her, and then brought her back to Gooseneck Holler in Christiansburg. And as she said, she didn't know it then, but she realized that God had this little piece of heaven ready for her. She said she cried a lot when she woke up the next morning and looked around and realized where she was. So with her being from Ohio, she had not really experienced segregation like it was in the South. And she has this attitude of, I don't care, right? I can remember her telling stories about my grandmother telling her when she would go to town and go shopping that, Black people weren't allowed to try on clothes. And she was just like, whatever, and going into Legacy department store and trying on clothes. And nobody said anything, right? She's just an amazing woman who helped ingrain this attitude of her. She would make a comment that it just dwells in the back of my head all the time. Who said so? When someone would say something that she didn't agree with or she questioned, she would necessarily get into a big discussion. She would just say, who said so? Right? And that would kind of be the end of it. It's like, whatever. So that attitude of who said something can't change or something has to be a certain way because of race or socioeconomic situations or whatever. If it's not just, then who said so? So you just ignore it, change it, do something different. So growing up in those first few years of integration, the first 2 years was in a classroom with a teacher who had 1st and 2nd grade students together in a small classroom. When I reflect and go back into that building now, I'm like, oh my goodness, how did this happen? So we're talking kids that came from all over the surrounding area. We were bused in, or other children were bused in because I just lived about a mile from that building, Friends Elementary School. And when you think about it, you had a classroom full of, at that time, 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds, 1st and 2nd graders. And there had to have been at least 15 to 20 children in each of those classes, if not more. And I remember someone meeting with me, and I can't remember the individual's name, and they showed a roster where Montgomery County showed how many the students that were in this school, Friends Elementary, and in the classes. And it had this crazy little number, like 10 or 12 students in the class. And I looked at I said, my family alone was bigger than that. So I know that this is not correct. So the numbers that were put out there to reflect how many students were actually being taught by one teacher in a classroom, they're not true. So I would love someday to go and figure out how to look that information up again to see exactly how the African American population was documented in Montgomery County during that period of time, especially at the elementary level, because that school had 4 classrooms. First and second were together, third and fourth were together, fifth and sixth were together. And I remember going into that fifth and sixth grade classroom. And by that time, kids are getting big. And it was the same size as, or if not smaller than, the first and second grade classroom. And the kids were just wedged in there. I remember trying to walk between the seats because I had bought a cocoon to school, and it hatched, and it was a lunar moth. I will never forget that. Anytime I see a picture of one or whatever, it's like, I know that's a lunar moth, right? And had it in a jar, and was able to carry that around to the other classrooms to show them, what had hatched out of the cocoon. And you could barely get between the rows of students because that classroom was so jam-packed. And then the 7th grade was in a classroom by itself. 3rd grade experience was at Willa Baker Elementary School in the Cambria area. And I explained that experience as walking into a school that was full of the Daughters of the Confederacy.
Wow.
They did not want us there. It was obvious. I don't know if it was just because of where the school was located and how the district lines were drawn. It was mostly poor white students and a handful of African American students, where the line stopped. The traditional, I won't say traditional, but the African American community, because we could only live certain places, so we tended to live in the same area. And the line stopped not far from that school. And because my family lived out in the county, we were not in Christiansburg, we were Cambria at that time. So it was a small population of African American families because we lived on literally the other side of the hill. And we went to this school. So students who I had spent the first 2 years of my education with at Friends Elementary School and went to church with many of them, played with many of them, all of a sudden we were separated and thrown into a world that was not good. I learned very little. So came into that in the 3rd grade. The 4th grade, I would make up stories of being sick, not feeling good. I would do things to try to make myself sick, like walking around outside without a coat on, no shoes on. My mother, many times, she had started working at the Arsenal, and if she was on the midnight shift, I would just kind of hide in my bedroom and miss the bus. And then when she would come home, because she wouldn't get home until after we had already gone to school, I would creep down the stairs and try to convince her that I didn't feel good. And a couple of times she just made me walk to school. I missed so much that I almost failed the 4th grade. And I remember the teacher getting with my mother and giving her makeup work. And one of the things I really didn't like about the 4th grade was Virginia history. I wasn't really sure why I didn't like it, but I just did not like it. I remember that book. I remember the smell of that book. The pictures in that book were basically black and white sketches, maybe a little tint of color to some of them. So between a teacher who obviously didn't care for you and just a situation that was not good. And then, so I managed to make up the work and pass fourth grade, went to fifth, and the school was first grade through fifth grade. And my whole world changed, so to speak, as far as education when I got out of that building. I basically made straight D's the whole time through that building. I learned little of nothing in first and second grade because of the size of the classrooms. And at that time, now I know that those teachers understood what was getting ready to happen to them. And they didn't know what their life was going to be, whether they were going to have jobs, what was going to happen to them. So I'm sure they were kind of distracted, or she was, because the one teacher was a bit distracted. I remember kids being all around her desk and her trying to check work and help students. And there was a couple of times she and I did not have a good time because she didn't understand that I needed more, or I knew more than what she thought I knew, and would say, well, that's not correct. And because I knew and thought it was, I remember having to change, her saying I needed to change an answer to a particular question. And I literally just erased it so much that I rubbed a hole in the paper. So, okay, there's a hole there. I can't write anything. It's just like, I'm not doing it, right? Won't write what you want me to write. So I just erased a hole into the paper so I couldn't write in that spot. Those first 5 years of my education were not good. Sixth grade, actually went back to Friends Elementary School because at that time, I guess the schools were getting overcrowded in Montgomery County and they needed some place to put children. So they opened that building back up, and sixth grade went to that building, I think in Montgomery County for about maybe 4 or 5 years before they built the new high school. That was interesting too, to go back to a building that you had started your education in, and now you're with a mixed group of students and not just all African Americans, all white teachers. So that was an experience. Anyway, so my education in Montgomery County schools, even through the 12th grade, was not good, just for many different reasons. In elementary school, that first few years, you had to really fight, and literally fight, and that was most of the students, my older sisters and brothers. But sports was a good outlet for me. So I played basketball and track, and those were really changing points for me. I had a teacher in the 7th grade. Her name was Georgia Cox, and Miss Cox was something else. So there are 2 teachers who had a big influence on me, and both their names are Mrs. Cox. Miss Georgia Cox and Miss Norma Cox. And I remember Miss Cox, Georgia Cox, she didn't really take anything from anybody. And her class was labeled that class. And we would get blamed for a lot of stuff and whatever. And she just was like, she would just ignore other teachers who would make comments or whatever, because we were her class, and that's all it was to it. So with all the faults or whatever that may have been in that classroom, because students were tracked, so you had this class were the smart students, and then blah 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 and on down. That was a bad situation. In the 6th grade, after coming out of those first 5 years, I received the award for the highest grade point average in social studies after coming out of that. In the 7th grade, I ended up because we were, again, tracked and grouped in a class where now it would never happen, where students literally were not taught. We we went to maybe one class, one regular class, and then the rest of the day you did nothing. You just sat in that classroom, or they would find some kind of odd jobs, or it was very, very strange. And I had to beg my mother. I had to tell her, said, Mom, they put me in this class and we're not doing anything. So finally they moved me to the next level of class. And in that class, the young man who ended up being our class valedictorian was in that class too. Now, he got placed in that class, and from their tracking, he should have been in the highest class. Anyway, when they finally realized they had made a mistake with him also, they pulled him out, and he really didn't like being with those other students. So they ended up putting him back in our class, but then pulling him out for math and English. But with science, he and I battled for the highest grade point in that class, back and forth. Before I was moved into that class, it was clearly he was the top student. When I came in, and I'm coming in like 6 weeks or more behind because I was in this other class and was able to compete with him, right? So, I sometimes get a little frustrated as if I had really had an education, where might I be, right? Or be able to do more or whatever. But I also know God has a plan. So sometimes those life experiences help us to understand and help others deal with things like that. I'm going to have to start including Mrs. Altizer too, because she really, when she saw that I could learn and that I was interested and that I was making A's in that classroom, she really kind of encouraged me and supported my thinking. And so that was when I understood, yeah, I've got a brain. There's some stuff going on here.
Right.
Mrs. Cox, it was her standing up and just the way she carried herself as I am somebody, and I'm not taking a whole bunch of nothing off of anybody. That helped me understood, yeah, this is what a woman could be. And she's very much like my mother with her attitude. And then Mrs. Norma Cox was the coach in high school, and her taking the extra time to help develop my talents, especially as a shot putter, and leadership, which that time I had no idea even what that was, right? It was just, you just do, right? That's how they helped develop me. My father died suddenly. To me, at least it was suddenly. I was 10. So we were from 17 years old to 4 years old. So my mother had really stayed at home except for some substitute teaching. When the schools were getting ready to be integrated, to be able to get some funding, Montgomery County had to hire some African Americans to help with a reading program. And she was hired, a couple, 2 or 3 African American women hired to go into the schools to help with reading. And she ended up at Willa Baker the year before I went to Willa Baker. And she talks about how the principal of the school, when she came in to introduce herself and whatever, she said she never looked at me. She just turned and looked out the window, never looked at her. So that environment was hostile to her even before the children got there. My mother was always civically involved with the NAACP and the church and all kinds of different things. And with her coming from Ohio and having a different mindset around what my rights are and what I'm able to do and what we should be doing as a community, also helped other people in the community understand, okay, we can do these things. And one of the things that she did was, for those who may be familiar with the Christiansburg Institute, well, we belong to Schaefer Memorial Baptist Church. And right next to Schaefer Memorial Baptist Church was the Hill School, which was the first site of Christiansburg Institute. And when they built the Institute, then that site became the elementary school for them until they built Friends Elementary School in the 60s. So that building was just empty. She was one who led the effort to open that building back up, to revamp it, and for it to become a community center for the African American community. So, I mean, those were efforts. When I think about it, I remember, again, because I was young, say 6, 7, and my father operated heavy equipment, and he got a bulldozer, and the basement of that building had gotten filled with mud and dirt, so it had to be dug out. And I remember people in that community, in that building, seeing people with wheelbarrows, hauling out dirt, and 5-gallon buckets hauling out dirt, and him with the bulldozer digging out. And when I think now what that undertaking that was to get that building back up and going. And when Head Start came to Montgomery County, that's the building where it was first housed at. So many programs went on in that building there. And the town actually tried to take it back at one time, and we're going to auction it off. And there were some trustees from the church who understood, no, that belongs to Schaefer. You cannot do that. And from what I'm told, literally the day of the auction showed up with the deed to the property, or that property would have been taken away from the Black community. But I always was a child who listened. So those were some of the things that really developed me. And when my father died and my mother went to work at the Arsenal on a swing shift, and I had younger brothers and sisters and older brothers and sisters, there were kind of many years gaps between us, like 3 sets of us who were leaving the house. The older ones, the younger ones, were younger. So you took on some more responsibilities. I learned to cook very early, but I had been watching my mother for years, so it kind of came natural. So, just so many different things. The older I get, the more I reflect on. I was always kind of an independent child. My mother will talk about her 7 children. She says, I have 7 children and they're all different. And she'll start kind of naming the characteristics of this one is my this and this one's my that. And I'm always the fighter.